Hi, my name is Dr. Nolan Stolz. I'm a music professor, a Black Sabbath scholar, and author of the book Experiencing Black Sabbath, A Listener's Companion. And today I wanted to talk to you about the song Heaven and Hell, how it developed from the demo stage to the version that we know on the studio album. So this demo recording was posted on the 4-year anniversary of the death of Geoff Nicholls, the longtime keyboardist and collaborator in Black Sabbath. He actually plays bass on this recording. And so there's so much to unpack. I spent that whole day listening to it, and today as well, listening for all the differences between where it was in the demo and the studio recording. And I've been writing down these ideas, making diagrams, and that's why I'm sharing this video today. Before I get into a detailed discussion of the differences between these two versions, I wanted to talk about the main difference between the two versions, and that is the formal structure. The demo version had a whole middle section that was removed. And so what I've done is in PowerPoint, I've made some diagrams of the formal structure, color-coded based on the material used, and I've labeled them. And then I'm going to walk you through that and then show you so you can see visually the differences. Here's a diagram of the formal structure of the demo version of Heaven and Hell. The first part of the song is essentially the same form as the album version, and that is essentially intro or main riff, 2 verses, bridge, and a 3rd verse. But what follows is significantly different. Labeled here as vocal/guitar for 20 measures is a section where Ronnie and Tony trade phrases. This section was replaced by a guitar solo for the studio version, but they used this material in live performances when they would open it up for an extended middle section. The little purple-colored bit is a short transitional melody played by Tony and Geoff. Again, remember, Geoff is on bass here, not Geezer. It's only 2.5 bars long, or 10 beats. The next section, labeled in a deep blue, is a guitar solo over the lament progression. And you might recognize that from the solo in NIB. After 8 bars, the tempo doubles and the guitar solo continues over that same lament progression. And then the chord progression changes for the next part, which is shown here in blue and light blue, and you'd recognize that part from the album version. The box here shows what was removed. Notice that only the end of the tan-colored section labeled vocal/guitar was removed. That is because the first 16 bars of it remains, with the guitar solo over the bass ostinato instead of the vocal and guitar trading. It's not surprising that this part was removed for 2 reasons. 1, it shortens the guitar solo so that verses 4 and 5 arrive earlier in the song. And 2, the lament progression isn't all that interesting or even related to the rest of the song. And there are other Sabbath songs with solos over that progression anyway. And here is the formal diagram of the studio version. You'll see how that middle part is now gone, but replaced with a guitar solo for 16 bars and then a half measure that leads into a return of the bridge, but only half of the bridge. And that goes directly into the fast section, skipping over that purple and dark blue section altogether, and then immediately goes into that final part. What is in the studio album, but not in the demo recording, is that little nice acoustic coda at the end. It's shown here in gold. Now, although it's on the album, it's not something that they would do live. Notice how both versions are about the same length. They're about 7 minutes. It's just that the studio version has an instrumental at the end, whereas the demo has a longer middle section. Now I'm going to walk you through a whole variety of differences between the 2 recordings. It could be any number of musical elements, but the first thing you might notice is that the tempo is a little bit slower on the demo. Bill counts the band in at about 83 beats per minute, and they come in at about 86. And you'll notice that Tony comes in a little bit early, and Bill comes in a little bit late. So it seems like Tony's trying to push the tempo ahead, and Bill's trying to hold it back a bit. Compare that to the album version, which is at 89 beats per minute, and then it slows down to 86 for the verse. On this demo, it slows down from 86 down to 84 and then 83 when the vocals come in. So it's not much, but it's about one click on a metronome. So say from 88 down to 84 on a standard metronome. 2, 3, 4. And let's listen to the verse. Sing me a song. So go ahead and compare that to the album version if you'd like, and you'll hear that it's just a hair slower. Another thing to listen to in this part of the song is the bass, because there are differences between what Geoff played here and what Geezer ultimately played on the album. For instance, Geezer follows Tony up. You got there. Okay, but then Geoff stays on the E. Now it's actually E flat minor, and that's the key I'm playing it on the keyboard. But just for the sake of because guitar players, if you want to play along, just detune to E flat, and then it'll work. So, anyways, so Geoff stays here, and then he moves. Okay, let's listen to that. 2, 3, 4. And then in the second half of the phrase, he does the same thing. He stays on E when Tony steps down. That part. And then he does a little bass fill. When Geezer does it, and this is one of the Geezer-isms I say in my book to describe of like what Geezer kind of changed. So he plays blues scale down. Fill. And then compare that to the more bluesy fill that Geezer plays. That brings us to the verse, and that's where we get that famous Heaven and Hell bass line, right? And we know that comes from the song Mainline Riders by Quartz, the band that Geoff was in right before working with Sabbath. That's this. And what's interesting is when we listen to the demo, Geoff isn't always playing 8th to 16th. He's not going. Sometimes he's just playing straight 8ths. Sometimes he drops in a... It seems to be related to the dynamics. So when he's trying to be very soft and subdued, is... And then when it's a little bit more aggressive, he's... So let's listen to that and just listen to the bass. So it's not as straightforward as when Geezer played it, which was straight through. So I'm going to turn it up a bit so you can hear the bass really clearly, and then I'm going to tap out the rhythm that he's playing, and you'll see that most of the time he's just playing straight 8ths, and once in a while he's dropping in a couple of those 16ths. I'm very curious to hear some other recordings for rehearsals and things from this time to see if Geoff played it more straight or if he played the do rhythm, because Geezer said he wouldn't have come up with that. He probably would have done something different, but he kept it. So I wonder like what Geezer had heard that he modeled it after. Another thing that Geezer added was a little fill after the words bringer of evil. It's the ABDE lick that he plays. It's another one of those Geezer-isms that I talk about. Geezer also added a little walk down on the word so it's. Here, let's listen to that. So it's on. So that leads us to the C, to the D, the pre-refrain. It's leading up to the song title, Heaven and Hell, the refrain. And by the way, the On and On, Heaven and Hell may have been the working title because that was written on the cassette. At any rate, this on the D, Geoff plays, which goes right along with the words heaven and. It doesn't quite work though, so I think Geezer just played the root there and left a space for Ronnie to sing the song title. Let's listen to that. So I call this a pre-refrain. It's too short to be a chorus, I think. And that brings us to the next section, which has that heavy riff. It's essentially a variation on the verse riff, and in fact is used as the riff for the third verse. So essentially, the material is very much related. And so you'll see that I've color-coded them as like a tan and brown, like different shades. So right here, we're right after the little yellow bit. That's the pre-refrain, and then the heavy riff for 4 bars. Then we go into the second verse. You'll see it's a little bit darker because we have these sustained guitars. Now, on the studio version, there's layers of guitar with, I'm pretty sure, our ebow playing this, sustaining the string. But of course, this is just Tony playing in a room, so let's hear how he kind of plays through the chords very lightly. The ending is just the beginning. The closer you... Did you hear the little A, B, D, E? The thing that Geezer plays. And in fact, Tony even plays that in the main riff to lead into the 4 bars that go before the first verse. So this little motif, which we can date back to the early 70s, and Geezer's playing this thing many times, and Tony as well. I mean, Paranoid, for example. So that becomes an important part of the song. So, but before it gets to the second verse, let's listen to the heavy riff that sets it up. On the demo, it's only 4 bars. On the studio recording, you get 4 bars and then another 2 bars of sustaining to bring down the dynamics, and then the verse starts. So if you can imagine the studio version, the verse comes earlier than you'd expect. Let's listen to that. But the vocals come in. You'll see in this diagram, just before V2, verse 2, in the demo version you have the 4 bars of the heavy riff, the brown. In the studio, the album version, just before V2, you see the little 2 measures there. That's to represent the chord sustaining it. It holds out, the dynamics go lower, and so I think this was a really good choice to insert those 2 measures after that 4 bars of heavy riff. It brings down the energy, dissipates that energy down into verse 2, and of course the volume as well. It gives a chance to the band to diminuendo or decrescendo down to verse 2. The next section of real interest is the bridge, shown here in red. And here we have Geoff playing a really nice bass line. He's not just playing the root of the chord, but he plays, and sometimes the third of the chord. So he creates a really harmonically rich sound. And before I show how his notes relate to Tony's guitar chords, I want to share how his notes relate to Ronnie's vocal part, because that has perhaps even more interest. And so what I'm showing you here is Ronnie's vocal part in the top staff, just a reduction, and essentially what Geoff is playing shown in the bottom part. It begins with a 7th and resolves to a 3rd, and then another 3rd. We get this series of parallel 3rds, another 3rd, another 3rd, and it resolves nicely to this octave, and then it holds out for one more bar. I'm going to play a recording from the bridge now, but it might be a little bit difficult hearing Ronnie's part, so I'm going to hit those notes on the piano, and I'm also accentuate the bass part, so you can just hear those 2 voices. So really try to pay attention to just the bass and the vocal line. what I think happened next was Geezer got the idea of playing a note other than the root in this section from what Geoff played, but he played different notes than what Geoff did. And I think what he did then was followed Ronnie's vocal part rather than following what Geoff had done on the bass. So I'm going to show that on the screen now. To compare the two versions, I have both of them here, and I'll play what Geezer does. So he starts with the same seventh, but he leaps up here, he creates a third, and you get these nice parallel thirds. And then rather than going to the F like Geoff did, he goes to the note that Ronnie is singing. So it ends up creating an octave. And he alternates between the A and the D in this measure, creating a fifth and an eighth. Fairly open sound. And then he goes to the same note that Ronnie sings, the G. And then he follows Ronnie again to the B. Then he splits, plays here, and then resolves to the octave. So it's not as harmonically rich as what Geoff played. However, with respect to what Tony is playing, it's just as interesting. I just happen to like what Geoff played there because of all the first inversion triads, which I'll come to in a second. Now, once we consider the full chord with what Tony's playing, we're seeing the bigger picture, and we see how those bass notes relate to the chords. What I really like is when Geoff goes from F and he goes down a step, C over E, and then he does the same pattern, G, and then to D over F sharp. It's that same pattern following Ronnie, but a third below. So let's hear that. That's the A minor 9 to the D, then to F, then C over E, then the G chord, and then D over F sharp, and then resolves to A. It's those first inversion triads, those C over E and the D over F sharp, that make it so harmonically rich. Geezer's version provides some even more interesting sonorities due to different inversions and things. So the A minor 9, but then he leaps up to the E, the fifth of that chord, so momentarily get second inversion, then G, and then he actually plays the F chord in first inversion. And by the way, so does Tony. But he oscillates between the A and a D, not in the chord. So he kind of creates like a D minor 7 chord momentarily. And he goes to a C over G, so it's in second inversion. So in this context, a really cool sonority. And then G over B. So we get another first inversion triad. But I like how he goes to the root position here. It starts to bring the section into focus, which sets up the last chord really well, I think. Both versions are great, but I really like how Geezer essentially takes Ronnie's line. So if anyone could be credited of coming with a bass line, it might even be Ronnie through his vocal part. Okay, let's go back to the demo now, the original key, the transposed to E flat minor. I know those last couple examples weren't transposed, but so I'm going to point out those first inversion triads that give a really cool sonority that Geoff creates with his bass line. Another difference in the bridge is that we don't have Ronnie's lead vocal part in which he's navigating between different notes in the chord. Instead, we have essentially one of the two background vocal parts. After the bridge, we have the third verse. So in both the demo and the studio versions, we have the heavy riff for 4 bars, and then it continues for the third verse. So unlike verse 2, where the heavy riff stops, here continues. So clearly there's a build-up that was planned even at the demo stage from verse 1 to verse 2, verse 3. And the key difference here is actually Ronnie's vocal part, and I'll show you that. The first couple lines of the third verse, Ronnie sings pretty much the same way on the demo as the studio version. There's a couple small differences, but the big difference is really on the third line. See, on the demo, he's singing it pretty much the way he did on the first verse, but on the studio album, he adds some blues inflection. So like, love can be seen, a little flat 5, right? But on the demo, he's just like, it's very much real straight. And then, and of course, Ensa, right? He kind of goes to like a pitchless, spoken-like thing on the studio version that we know. And listen to this, how straight it sounds in the demo version. See how straight that is? And then the last line, he jumps up, deep bleeds for the dancer. And listen how straight he sings it here on the demo. All right, so he's adding a little bit more stylization to it, make it a little bit more interest, which isn't surprising for a couple reasons. One, it's like, well, it's the third verse, let's sing it differently now. But also the band is having so much energy with that heavy riff that really, I think, inspires Ronnie to do more with the vocal line there. And that brings us to the third appearance of the pre-refrain. It's that small yellow sliver. It's only one measure this time because the chords go by twice as fast. And then there's that 2 bars before the vocal guitar section begins. And then on the studio version, you've got the same 1 bar pre-refrain and then 2 bars, and then the guitar solo starts. So on the studio album, in those 2 bars, that's when Ronnie sings and on and on and on and on and on, right? And so what he's doing there is he's closing that whole vocal part of the song to set up the guitar solo. Whereas in the 2 bars in the demo, Tony plays a guitar lick, and that sets up the whole vocal guitar trading section. These 20 bars of vocal guitar trading are really cool. It sounds like they're in a little blues club playing off one another. But apparently this was recorded in the house that they rented in Bel Air. So you can hear the smallness, the intimacy about it. And it's a really cool, so we'll give this a listen. Now, they would do this live, play off one another. So you'll recognize some of the things that Ronnie will sing and what Tony will play along with Ronnie and so forth. But the character is a little bit different just from the circumstance of where they are. Love that recording. It sounds like Sabbath in their blues element. And if you're paying attention to Ronnie and Tony and not really listening to Bill, listen again and pay attention to Bill. He's playing some syncopations, playing a bit funky. Really sounds very natural for him and the whole band, for that matter. Let's listen to that transitional riff one more time. It's 10 beats long. That transitional riff we heard at the end, that's marked in purple there, 2.5 measures, because this bit was removed I don't think they've really done anything with it. I don't remember it on any live recordings of Heaven and Hell. Plus, it's transitioning to the next section, which they didn't end up using in live performances of Heaven and Hell anyways. So it makes sense that this transitional riff would have been not really used anymore. In the next part of the song, Tony plays a guitar solo and Geoff plays the lament progression. That's E, and then D, and then C, and then B. And that's played 7 times. The first 2 times at the same tempo, and then 5 times with a double time feel. So it's a 4-bar phrase, and then once counting with a faster tempo, 8-bar phrase. It's, like I said earlier, it's not entirely that interesting of a progression. It could have been just a placeholder progression, just to have something there. But like I said, they've used it in other songs such as NIB, so it's not that unique to the song or anything. But what's really cool is that the very end of this, Geoff and Tony play this unison riff together to close this part. Let's listen to that now. Section that we just heard is labeled here in purple and deep blue, and that leads to the next part, which is labeled in blue and light blue, and you'll see that same part is in the studio version. It's just earlier in the song, coming after a half of a bridge labeled there. So let's talk about this chord progression that defines this part. The chord progression on the album is E minor, D over F sharp, G, and then D over A. Again, it's transposed to E flat minor. Now, the question is, where did the bass line come from? Because Geezer's not playing the root of the chord, he's walking up stepwise. And we can listen to the demo and find that Geoff played something similar, but he actually drops to the root of the D. But in the demo, Ronnie sings a vocal part that it ascends the same way that Geezer does on the bass. And then Ronnie drops back down to the third on that. So Ronnie and Geoff together is that fifth to the third. And so perhaps then Geezer, like before, took Ronnie's vocal part and used it as the bass line, which gives us a really interesting sonority in that fourth chord by putting the D over the A. But then that vocal part is not on the studio album. So let's listen to that demo. That 8-bar phrase is played twice, and then it goes to verse 4. And you'll see it labeled here 8 plus 4 because that's how the phrasing works. It goes through the 8-bar progression, and then there's a 4-bar extension. And I'll show how that works. On the album version, you have E minor, D over sharp, G, D over A, E minor again, D over F sharp, and then it loops back again. Okay, so on the demo version, rather than going to D chord the second time, Tony and Geoff play a little unison line. Let's listen to verses 4 and 5 now, and you're going to notice two things. One, that the lyrics in verse 5 are different, and the other thing is that the tempo is much slower. So on the studio recording, it's about 205 beats per minute, and here we're only at about 180. So we're talking about 3 clicks on the metronome different. Now, this demo, they went to a double time feel, and it's a little bit faster than double time, whereas on the studio album, there's a full stop, and then a new tempo starts that's more than double time, which I think helps to separate the sections more, whereas here in the demo, it just goes to twice as fast, and it doesn't feel as separate. So I think it's effective to put this faster tempo on the studio version. Now, I think you'll notice it on the words, because they don't come out as fast as we're used to. So it comes back to this section again to sort of bookend those two verses. And of course, on the studio album, you have Ronnie singing vocal parts, Fool, Fool, Got to Bleed for the Dancer, and so on, to close it out, which is, you know, more interesting than just the ascending line. But hey, that ascending line ended up being used for the bass part, so there you go. So if you haven't heard the demo in its entirety, you definitely should. There's a lot to enjoy, there's a lot to learn from. It's really cool, and it's especially cool to hear Geoff on bass. That's such a rarity, so we're very fortunate to have that available to us. And I hope more recordings come to light over the coming years, weeks, whenever. There's a lot for us to enjoy. So if you have any questions for me, shoot me an email. It's nstolz@uscupstate.edu. I'll put that email in the description. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks.